Welcome to The Third Story. I'm your host, Leo Sidran, coming to you today from the Best Western in downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today's conversation features saxophonist and composer Chris Potter. Saying Chris Potter plays saxophone is like saying Serena Williams plays tennis, or Steven Spielberg directs films, or Annie Leibovitz takes pictures. It's not inaccurate. It just doesn't tell the whole story. Chris is one of the most influential jazz saxophone players alive. Downbeat Magazine has called him one of the most studied and copied saxophonists on the planet, which is only slightly ironic considering he was a fair weather student himself, at least as a formal student by the time he got to music school in New York. But that's because at 18 years old, when he moved to New York from Columbia, South Carolina, where he had grown up, he began working almost immediately with trumpeter Red Rodney. Red had heard Chris play at a jazz festival in South Carolina and told him to give him a call when he got to New York. That's an old jazz story. Like, for example, singer John Hendricks once told my dad the story of how Charlie Parker heard him sing in Toledo, Ohio, and said, "Hey, look me up when you get to New York." And that's how John got to New York. Of course, Charlie Parker was one of the creators of bebop, the language that informed all the jazz that came after him in one way or another. And Red Rodney had played with Charlie Parker when he was just a young man. I know this is a bit circuitous, but stay with me. This means that Chris Potter, at 18 years old, in the early 1990s, was in a kind of direct lineage to bebop. Working with Red Rodney at such a young age gave him a chance to connect with the history and the legacy that still underpins jazz. But it would also turn out to give him the foundation and the freedom to move beyond specific style, category, limits, and start a life of creative searching. Early in his career, Chris also logged serious hours and miles working with drummer Paul Motion, pianist Rini Rosnes, bassist John Patitucci, the Mingus Big Band, and Steely Dan. He's had a long and very fruitful musical relationship with bassist and composer Dave Holland, with whom he still works regularly, and he's made a series of influential solo albums in various formats and on various labels. We talk about two specific records here today. The album Gratitude, which he made in 2001, on which he pays tribute to the saxophonists who inspired him. And we talked about Circuits, his most recent solo recording. I have to say, going into this conversation with Chris, I thought a bit about how to approach it because he's very prolific, very influential, and he belongs to a generation of musicians who have been so heavily documented. He's in his late 40s now, that much is known about him. I mean, the technical aspects of what he does are available to almost anyone who wants to find out. And he's spoken publicly about the influence of various players, teachers, band leaders on his development. So I kind of decided not to go down that road with him. And fortunately, that wasn't really the road he was leading me down anyway. Instead, we had a rather introspective and very sensitive conversation about art in general, about the search for something new, about what motivates him today, what he sees as his role and responsibility in the history of the music that he makes. He says, everybody has feelings. That isn't what separates the artist from the non-artist. Being able to express those feelings in a way that can be communicated is the job of the artist. And it's never finished because feelings are never finished. And he also tells me that all art is in some way a conversation between those who came before and those who are making it now. Third-story.com is the place to go. You know this. Sign up, subscribe, get involved, drop me a line, say hello, click on a social link, check out the archive. And while you're there this week, you can also find the Spotify playlist and YouTube clips that I have curated relative to this conversation, as I often do. There's a Spotify playlist that includes some of the music that we talk about in this conversation, both music that Chris has been a part of and also that influenced him. And there are some pretty hip YouTube links there as well for you to check out. And then once you're riding high on the good vibrations, once you're motivated, once you're inspired, if you so choose, you could visit patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast. That's where you can go to make it official. That's where you can go and put some skin in the game, become a patron, and support this project. Without further ado, here it is, my conversation with Chris Potter. Chris Potter, welcome.
Thank you.
You're like a minute and a half into my house and already mentioned that, you know, your cats are needy because you've been out of town.
Yes, I've been gone. My whole family's been gone for the whole summer.
Oh, your whole family's going to be
gone? Yeah, because they go to Hungary during the summer. That's where my wife is from. So when I haven't been on the road, I've been hanging out there.
We are practically neighbors.
Yeah.
I've never, that I'm aware of, passed you on the street. To me, that speaks a little bit to the fact that I think you're probably on the road a lot.
Yeah, I'm gone. I'm gone a fair amount. Not all the time by any means, but that's the only way you can do it, to be able to play creative music and actually get paid for it and pay the rent, pay the mortgage.
So do you have a sense of how much you're gone?
It's got to be something close to half the days. Maybe more, maybe less.
Yeah.
I would say less. My wife has said more. I don't know. We'll see.
Could be less and feels like more.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you still dig it?
Yes and no. I mean, I would really enjoy being home more. I have a daughter who's 11. I'd like to spend as much time with her as I could, and I enjoy being home. It's great being here. On the other hand, as I was saying, like if I want to play, I have to get on the plane. That
raises this age-old question. I mean, maybe it's not age-old. There was a time, I think, when people probably lived in New York and worked a lot in New York.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, you could do 6 weeks at the Vanguard and then do a month at the 5 Spot. I mean, yeah, those days are definitely gone.
I saw this video of you the other day, 18 years old, playing with Red Rodney.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, what I really want to know when I see that is what happened before that led you to be that guy.
Yeah. I got into it really young. I started playing the saxophone when I was 10. Neither of my parents are musicians, but they're into music, and they had not a large record collection, but an interesting, varied record collection where they had Mozart and Beethoven, and also the Beatles and Joni Mitchell and Buddy Guy and Miles Davis and Dave Brubeck. I would just really, I just enjoyed getting their records out and listening to it. I didn't even necessarily know what anything was, but I always loved music, and I always enjoyed trying to figure it out. I always refused to take piano lessons because everyone I knew who took piano lessons hated playing the piano, and when I heard them play, I didn't think they sounded that good. I thought, I'd rather figure this out myself. So when I was 9 or 10, I guess I had found their jazz records enough. I'd listened to Paul Desmond and gone, wow, maybe that's an interesting sound.
Well, I've heard you talk about that when you heard Paul Desmond, that was the first time that you heard the saxophone and thought,
in a new way, yeah.
I want to do that.
Right.
But you had been listening to the records before that? A little bit.
But I think it was when I discovered Time Out. And I mean, I'd also had the chance to see people play live, like my first saxophone teacher. There was a group that came to my school when I was in 4th grade or something like that. I remember seeing them play.
Of local players.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that made an impression as well.
Man, that's such a story that you hear going all the way back, to what it looked like when you saw a band walk into a room or on stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just hear them, but to see.
Yeah, to see people actually doing it.
So it seems like, fixated on saxophone until you got one.
Yeah, and then I was off and running. Then I just really got into it for whatever reason. I was just hooked, completely hooked. And started to discover the whole history. I mean, at that point I was playing alto. At first I was into Johnny Hodges so much. I mean, I was and still, just absolutely love everything about the Ellington oeuvre. And that saxophone section. Everyone that ever passed through that section just had such an incredibly distinctive sound. I mean, of course, Johnny Hodges and also Harry Carney, Paul Gonsalves, on and on and on. So that was the first thing that kind of got me. I was into that, and then I got into Charlie Parker, who I didn't really appreciate when I first heard him when I was 11 or something.
What did you hear or not hear in him? Do you think
it seemed kind of sharp, and it seemed like a lot of notes. And the themes were very, what is the word? It was just too much. It just didn't connect with me at that time. It wasn't until I heard him playing ballads with strings that I started to understand what he was doing with the language, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, and then I was off and running with that, and I mean, of course I got into everything he ever recorded. But I guess there's a certain time and place when you're ready to hear something that maybe you didn't appreciate the first time around.
Well, what's interesting to me is that you seem like you were drawn to a kind of a romance in the music initially.
Melody.
Melody, yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of younger musicians, when they come to any kind of music, they tend to be drawn more to like virtuosity and loudness and stuff like that. And you didn't respond to that. No, that wasn't
really it. No, it was about expression. It was about melody. I mean, it still is for me, I mean, I know, I've gotten to where I can play things fast, whatever, but that's not really the point of what I've been looking for this whole time.
Right. Do you think you know what the point is of what you've been looking for?
I know it when I hear it, you know. I know it when it feels like I'm expressing something that is what I meant to say, you know, which doesn't happen 100% of the time, but that's such an abstract criteria, but it doesn't feel abstract at all. Actually, it feels like a completely concrete thing. Like, yeah, that's actually what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. Or no, I was a bit confused and I was flailing around and I just couldn't quite find it.
Do you find in most cases that you are able to express what you hear?
You do the best you can, you know, and of course you're always looking at what you've done and going, oh man, it could have been like this. It could have been a little better like this. Maybe I should have thought about this. You know, that can be a very useful part of the growth process. It can also be a negative thing depending on how you use it. You know, if you pick it apart too much and go, oh man, maybe, you know, this or that, you know, then maybe you start to lose that feeling, like I was saying, where you know what expresses you and what doesn't. You know? I've
heard you say often that you love to practice. You would love to be able to practice more than you do, that practicing is like a very rewarding and fulfilling thing for you.
Yeah.
How much of your feeling that you've expressed something that you wanted to express is connected to your practicing?
Oh, it's very much. I mean, there's no way to put the feelings into a form without working on the craft of it. I mean, that's kind of one of the, I don't know if it's a paradox about art, but it's a bit, you know, is that everybody has feelings, you know. That isn't what separates the artist from the non-artist. It's not any kind of, I mean, maybe some people, you know, I mean, everyone feels things in a different way, which is the beauty of it. But you know, maybe some people seem more sensitive to one emotional spectrum than another, or whatever. But that isn't really the whole point. I mean, being able to express those feelings in a way that can be communicated is kind of the job of the artist, and it's never finished, you know, because feelings are never finished, and to be able to express it as well as you can, it takes a lot of work, both actual practicing and also conceptualizing, which can be without the instrument in your hands, you know. It can come from relationships. It can come from exposure to other forms of art, you know, whatever you know, things you think about when you're lying awake at night when you're jet lagged. I guess that's my own.
That's right. Now we're talking about you. But that's the thing, right? I mean, that's a big question right now in creative music, because there are so many highly educated, prepared musicians who maybe are like over prepared in one aspect of what they do and maybe haven't had any real personal experience to inform emotionally what they're trying to say. Yeah, that's a little bit of a loaded thing to say, but I know
what you mean. I mean, you know, it's a different situation than it used to be, I think, to a certain extent, because education used to be rarer. You know, now there's information flying at us from every corner, and you know, but the time it takes to figure out who you are can unfortunately be spent doing other things, chasing other things. Even if you want to get to that point, even if you're the kind of person that cares about it, you know, it can be difficult not to get kind of swallowed up in the sea of information and feel like you need to know everything.
Well, so where did you fit in all that? Because as we started by saying, you know, I saw this video of you the other day, 18 years old, playing your ass off with Red Rodney, who was a 1 degree of separation from Bird. So you start your career off really totally inside of the lineage. Yeah. And understanding, you know, what those guys were like. So how did you sort of navigate that? Because you were very young.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think that video that you're talking about might have even been right before I moved to New York, because that was in Columbia, South Carolina, I think, which is my hometown. And there was a jazz festival there. That's where I met Red.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And so if I was 18, you know, it would have been in the spring. And then in the fall, I moved up to New York, you know, and he said to give him a call. And I joined his band.
So he heard you play at that jazz festival?
Yeah, exactly.
And he said, give me a call.
Yeah. So I did, of course, you know, terrified, but I did. And yeah, I was just putting one foot in front of the other. I mean, you know, I guess I was advanced in one sense of being able to get around on the horn, and I was already thinking, I think, about the kind of things that I'm talking now. I mean, it's had, you know, I've had many more years to put more connections together and have more experiences. But I was also an 18-year-old kid that hadn't ever lived away from home, and I was from Columbia, South Carolina, and all of a sudden I moved to New York. So I was very naive, I think, and also I didn't grow up, with music in my family, so the whole culture of it was kind of new to me.
And how you might one day make a living or have a...
Yeah. I mean, I had worked a lot when I was in high school, so I did have the chance to get to know people who made music for a living, but not touring jazz musicians.
Yes. I know that you played on Joey Alexander's first record.
It's not his first one, I don't think.
Oh, is it not his first one?
I don't think so, no.
You played on a Joey Alexander
record. Yeah, exactly,
record.
yeah.
And, I was thinking, okay, so Joey is a highly talented, virtuosic, prodigal kid. But because of the world that we're in today, he reaches like the universe immediately,
Yeah.
And so his development plays out totally in public.
Right.
You, at a similar age, were kind of
I was still
nurtured.
in South Carolina, yeah.
You were in your community.
Exactly.
So you weren't dealing with the same kinds of like public pressure that a kid today who shows that kind of talent might be facing.
I mean, some of it was also just my family situation. And I mean, it just didn't happen. There wasn't the decision to come to New York.
Right.
I was in high school.
Right.
And I'm glad, It can be very difficult to, even as it happened for me, I feel like it was difficult in some ways.
In what sense?
To kind of transition from that, wow, he's so young and he can play, to going, well, no, if I really want to do something here, like, yeah, it's great that I can do this, but it's not enough. Like, I need to keep going. And the experience of coming to New York and not having everything kind of handed to me on a plate, I mean, it was a little bit frustrating in a way because, it was like, hey, wait a minute, I thought everybody said I was so good, but
So you did feel that when you got here. You did feel a little bit like it was...
Slightly, which in retrospect, is kind of ridiculous. I mean, I was playing with Red, and I was,
That's what I'm thinking.
I mean, it was a few years before I was making enough money to actually pay my rent, just playing jazz gigs. It did take, a handful of years to get to that point. I was doing lots of weddings. I was very fortunate that my folks could help me out to a certain extent. Yeah. But in retrospect, I mean, I guess because it was a certain time, like, Wynton had gotten signed, like there was a thing of record companies signing young musicians.
Yes.
And I wasn't really on that list.
You weren't on that trajectory for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, I was in New York and I was working, and I kind of did what I set out to do. What I had in mind, was that I wanted the chance to play with a lot of the people that I had been listening to, and I got that experience. I mean, I think at the end, like now that I look back, I think I got something much, much more valuable than a recording contract.
Yes.
Which was the chance to play with Red, the chance, to play with the Mingus Big Band through a total fluke, go on the road with Steely Dan, play with Paul Motion, one after another of these very, very different situations that gave me a lot of insight into different, areas of the history of the music and how these masters thought about it and how they saw themselves fitting into it and how they put together a band, and gave me time to digest this, which I feel like I'm still doing. I mean, I feel like jazz is such a huge language now. I mean, with such, wide range of sounds and things that have happened over the history to really kind of synthesize things and put them together. It's not, it's a very rare person that can put that together at a very young age at this point. I mean, maybe Charlie Parker, he could come along, and I mean, it was just a revolutionary thing. It's hard to imagine that happening now because of, so much more information again being thrown at us.
Boy, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. I mean, the first thing that I guess I think about is, I forget that you're actually quite young, because I think you started so young and you've just been kind of relentlessly at it, as you say, just keep moving forward, keep moving it forward. You talk about like that Steely Dan experience. I think probably that's the first time I heard you, and I guess I assumed that, because at the time I was living in the Midwest and where I came from, and I guess I assumed that you just must be like much older than me.
At the time I went on the road with them, which there was a recording made of that called Alive in America.
Yes.
Right? That was like 1993, so I was 22.
Yeah.
and I'd been playing with the Mingus Big Band, and I think that what happened was Donald Fagen came down to hear it and got my number from Randy Brecker and whatever. One of those things that worked out.
Yep.
And that was music that I had grown up listening to too. I mean, I was very familiar
Yes.
with their work. Didn't ever expect to be sharing a stage with them, especially because they hadn't even been on a stage in,
Years. Yeah, that's
like
right.
20, 25 years or something.
Right. That's right.
So it was a trip. And it wasn't ever my goal to be on the stage of Madison Square Garden, but there we were, playing like sold out. I think they were more freaked out than anybody else because they had less performance experience than anyone in the band, including me.
That's right.
Yeah.
But as you say, that wasn't even necessarily what you were working on doing. That's just
no. But I mean, you work on your language and you work on how you want to express, and then you can bring that into any situation. Hopefully, I mean, if it's a situation that it helps to know the history of that, and I mean, to not only know Charlie Parker, but also to know, okay, well, then, Maceo Parker, like, how did he make that kind of thing fit into a more funk electrified context, things like this, like just knowing the context and knowing what other people have done so that you can make your decisions about what you want to do.
Well, I think this maybe helps tie up this other idea that you had about whether or not a Charlie Parker can exist in today's context. And as you said, there's just so much information to synthesize that it doesn't really work in the same way. I mean, I read something that you said at one point where you said, listen, I'm just doing, I think, my version of what Louis Armstrong was doing or anybody else, which is kind of synthesizing the popular elements around me.
Right.
But there's so much more of that to synthesize that it doesn't necessarily work itself out into a common language.
It's just a different time, a different place. I mean, it's kind of the same as like, there's not going to be a new Beatles either.
Right.
It's just that was a time and a place and a specific situation. Louis Armstrong came right at the beginning of this music and was from the very inside of that culture. I mean, he was that, and that's what you hear in this music. We each have our story and our place that we come from, and whatever contribution we can make, we do the best we can with it.
That raises a question of being in the music or being in the culture, and to what extent those are.
You mean the culture, like the jazz culture?
Yeah, or that the music emerges out of culture.
Yeah, definitely.
As opposed to being something that is like studied and intentionally created.
Well, right. I mean, that's one of the really interesting things, and maybe a big thing that drew me to jazz to really put my life's work into it, was that it has all this complexity. I mean, huge level of complexity in every way, just like any sort of classical music you could name, but also has this aesthetic of absorbing what's on the street, and that if it's not connecting in that way, then it's not doing its job. It's right in between.
Yes,
for me that's sort of a sweet spot because you get both things. Now, I mean, it's not necessarily, it means that it's not going to reach Taylor Swift numbers. Anyone that expects that is just, it's just not, because it takes more energy to listen to.
Yes.
And when you put yourself in it and you do put that energy into listening to it, it also gives you more back, I think. But there's a place for really well done pop music. There's there's sort of a place for everything, I think. But this is the thing that's interesting to me is the extreme attention to the craft and all the different possibilities of it, along with needing to keep it, something that speaks to me as a person within a culture, not just musically interesting. Like interesting isn't enough. It has to kind of hit you. And when you hear Louis Armstrong, I mean, that's the big thing you're hearing. You're hearing the sound of a certain time and place, and the music had a function within that. And that's proving to be the thing that's the hardest to keep in jazz, I think.
Is a function in a time and place within the context of today.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I have that feeling with me and my friends. I mean, it feels like there's a community of musicians that it really does mean, it is our life, and it's very connected to the way we live. But I think it's a small scene, and there isn't a 52nd Street.
That's right.
That would be nice to have, but that's not what we have now.
Is it entertainment?
Clearly, it's not just entertainment. I mean, where does that begin and end? You know,
Right, I don't know.
Like, was Lester Young thinking about entertainment? I mean, it didn't seem like he wasn't a showbiz kind of guy.
Yeah.
You know, and I've been, thinking about him a lot, actually, like, that influence, I think,
Yeah.
Then you think about, so just slightly later, Charlie Parker, maybe even less so. Coltrane, even less than that. Like, just not about show business. I mean, still about communication.
Yes.
Still about art. And of course, there's all the layers of, that it was important to them maybe to show the depth of, that African Americans didn't just have to be entertainers.
Yeah, absolutely.
That they're, this is serious art, and they're saying something about their lives, and that really needed to be stressed. And I think they saw themselves in that way, and I think it progressed. I mean, if you think about Lester Young to Charlie Parker to John Coltrane, I mean, there's just the political situation in the country
yes.
was changing along with the way that they approached it.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that assessment of what happened within the African American culture.
Right.
Over time, jazz has also become whiter and whiter.
I mean, it's interesting if you look at a lot of the audiences, at least in the YouTube clips that we have
yes.
of these people, there were a lot of white audiences for a long time.
Yes.
And there were always white people involved in the music. I mean, from the very, very beginning.
Yes.
Not as the dominant culture that created it, but there were always white musicians who went, "Wow, now that's cool.
Yes.
I want to be a part of that."
Yes.
And now, who does it belong to? I don't know. I think it's up to us. I mean, it's definitely something I think about a lot.
Do you feel a difference in playing with black musicians and white musicians?
Not.
I've never asked that question of anybody.
I don't even know how to answer that because I feel different playing with different musicians.
Yes.
If they're white, that's part of their identity. That's how you grow up. You're treated a certain way. If you're black, you're definitely treated. I mean, it's kind of an inseparable part of their identity. So I guess yes, but not because of the color of their skin, but just because that's who they are.
Yes.
And there's a difference between maybe playing with people that grew up in a different culture that aren't American too, and it's not a value judgment at all. It's not they're better or worse. It's that there's a certain approach to the music that I think is different related to the culture that you're coming from, which as I'm saying is the whole point. It should be related to who you are and where you come from, and not something to pretend to be from something else.
It's about us kind of personal authenticity.
Personal, yeah, exactly. I mean, we're all authentically who we are.
Yes.
And however, I mean, a lot of it comes down to also just our approach to other people. I mean, I would want to be treated as authentically myself and appreciated for what that is. And the other side of that is, it's very important that I look at other musicians that way too, that it goes back and forth, And I mean, it's obviously a touchy thing too, the whole thing. And this didn't used to be something people talked about at all, but the idea of cultural appropriation. I still have very mixed feelings about that being an issue because, I mean, I understand there's a colonialist, whatever mentality to it, but there's also, I mean, that's how new stuff gets made. Now it's a question like, is it the dominant power appropriating from the less dominant power? But at a certain point, boy, what does it matter? I mean, we're all humans. I mean, but it depends on how it's done.
Yes.
Always. It's like how it's done, and it's not really something you can codify. But I've always tried to look at it, if I'm approaching whatever influences I have with a real genuine love for it and an attempt to understand where they were coming from on their terms, that's kind of the best anyone can do. And I feel like people, I guess, maybe know that enough about. I don't really feel that it's an issue in my life at this point.
Yes.
So it's all good.
Yeah. Yeah. What a beautiful answer. Thank you. I mean, I love even the initial response of saying, listen, every part of who we are informs what we feel and what we do with those feelings.
Yep.
And so, yes, every part of of a person's identity is in there. I
Right.
think that's it.
Which includes race, includes gender, includes class,
Yes.
all that stuff, but goes beyond that.
Yes.
It's not just a collection of groups that you're in. It's how you process music and how you feel things and how it comes out
Yes.
of your instrument.
Yeah, and you also mentioned this thing about international identity or different cultural identity, which is something I wanted to ask you about because there is a narrative in which jazz is America's art form, and,
it originally came from America. Yeah.
but today it's very alive outside of America.
Yeah, which is great. It's only enriching the music, I think.
Yes. What do you see outside of the States? You also probably perform at least as regularly, if not more regularly, outside of the States.
Yeah, I perform a lot outside of the States. And I don't always have a chance to hear the local musicians, but in many cases now, there's a network of community that stretches way beyond America's borders, and there are lots of people that I've worked with.
Well, this bass player, for example, on Circuits that you on your new record.
Yeah, well, he's originally from Mauritius, actually, but he's been living in France for many, many years.
And that's where you heard him?
That's where, I'm trying to remember where I even first met him.
Remind me his name, I'm sorry.
His name is Linley Mart. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, he's an amazing musician. He really is. He was in one of Zawinul's last groups, I think, and he'd been working with Eric Harland a lot, and that was the whole kind of project came about just as a really fluke set of events. Like, I'd written this music, and then I was like, "Hey, Eric, I don't really know who to call." He's like, "Man, you should call James Francis," who I didn't know.
Yeah.
So I called him, and it was fantastic. And I was like, "Wow, we should record this." But then there were on that first tour we did, there was like a gig or two that James couldn't make. So I called Linley. So he made the gigs without James, and then I wanted to have him on the recording too.
I saw you at the Sunset in July of 2017.
Well, that was probably the first time we got together. That was with Eric and James.
James and Eric, yeah.
Yeah, that was when we were just first playing the music.
Yeah. Not only do I remember the gig, but I also remember who was in the room and how many musicians were in the room. And, this sense of excitement to see what this project was going to be and feeling of like energy just coming out off of the room.
It's nice when you have that.
Yes.
I've been doing this a long time. I know it's not always like that. So I appreciate it when when there is some excitement around something that I'm doing.
Well, that's fair. And on the other hand, people say amazing things about you. Things that if you read them, I wonder what you'd make of it. Things that people say you're the greatest saxophone player alive, the most transcribed, most studied, but you still have to wake up every morning and put the horn in your mouth.
Yeah, exactly. That's not something I can't afford to think about it. Honestly, it freaks me out.
Does it?
Yeah, a little bit. There's a feeling, especially as I get older, there's a feeling of like a real responsibility that, oh wow, now I've put myself in this situation.
Wait, you put yourself in this position by playing? Yeah,
right.
But
right.
Just doing what you were doing.
And being visible and having the good fortune to be an artist that someone is checking out and influenced, and then meeting younger musicians who are influenced by what I do gives even more of a feeling of responsibility that, wow, okay, yeah, I got to keep coming out with it. And when I think about my heroes and what they meant to me, it's like there's a role now to fill that I hope I can do with, grace and wisdom.
I mean, I know you say you can't afford to think about that, but it sounds like to some extent you do let it influence.
Well, I mean,
your
it's
choices.
impossible to just the fact that I'm able to work. I mean, I don't even take that for granted. It's like just that there is even enough of a scene left that me and my friends are all making a living and can support families and whatever. Doing this, is an amazing thing and a great privilege to be involved in, and not something to take lightly. And I would like to see that happen for another generation of players after me too. And I think the things that me and my age group, I think that affects it, keeping the excitement going about what this music is and what it can be, what the possibilities are, which I think are endless, completely endless.
Well, I think that there's something about your mentality, your approach to it, hearing you talk about this, part of it generationally also, you're just on the cusp.
Right.
I mean, you came of age before what I sometimes refer to as the jazz education industrial complex. I mean, before there were so many students.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to a Jimmy Ebersole camp when I was a kid, but I mean, it was right before CDs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, record companies were still, they were making a lot of money. When the CDs came out, then they could sell the whole catalog, you know.
Yes.
And then seeing that whole thing just completely change because
Yes.
of the digital age and everything in the digital. I mean, that seems to be the biggest thing. You know, it seemed to me that the jazz education world was already growing,
Mm-hmm.
and continues to grow.
Yes.
That was maybe the biggest change that I saw in the music business, was the kind of collapse of this system, which could be, you know, benign or
Yes.
or negative depending
Yes.
on what happened, but it just, like, the bottom fell out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hearing you say it was not necessarily replaced by the education. The education
I think that was
component
already coming.
Yeah.
You know, but it's gotten more.
Yes.
It's gotten more.
But that's only one example of how you kind of sit on the cusp, because
Yeah.
having come up with Red Rodney and understanding, really playing with an original bebopper,
Yeah.
I could imagine that there would be a version of your story in which here we are 30 years later and you're saying jazz needs to include the following 4 ingredients in order for it to be this music.
Right.
And I'm not, I mean, I guess I should ask you what it is and what it isn't, but I'm not hearing you say that. I'm hearing you say it needs to be able to incorporate
It needs to be able to incorporate
and absorb and grow.
anything. Yeah. I mean, on the other side, just to maybe balance that out.
Yes.
I mean, the things that I think about and where my language is coming from, and
Yeah.
it really is, it's coming from that.
Yes.
And I'm still listening a ton to Lester Young and Charlie
Yes.
Parker and John Coltrane
Yes.
and all these people, and Johnny Hodges, and I mean, just, you know, so not in order to copy what they do, but to really try and dig into the essence of what they were about in order to create something that has that much depth.
Yes.
That's what's hard. I mean, it's because it's possible to kind of throw some things together that are half-baked, but to have it all come together in a way that really makes sense is a bigger challenge.
Right.
You know, I think it helps. I mean, it's not just that it helps, but the way that I see it, hip-hop and all that, I mean, it's such a direct outgrowth that it doesn't require a complete change in aesthetic sensibility to get into it. I mean, maybe some of the terms have changed, the technology's changed, the actual, you know, instruments producing the sounds have changed, but the underlying aesthetic, like, you know, a rapper who can really freestyle, is really the same. It's a continuation of this African American musical sensibility that's come into the wider culture. You know, I think that's one reason that makes it feel like it's not like it's a complete break.
Yes.
At all. It's a matter of figuring out how to use it in a different way.
I absolutely hear in you also that hip hop influence, because there's a big part of the work that you keep coming back to that's totally groove oriented.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think of it that there's different kinds of grooves.
I dig
too.
it.
I mean, it can be out of time.
Yes.
And have a groove or not.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, that's where I feel the music. That's how I feel it, is from the rhythm. If I can kind of connect to it rhythmically,
Yes.
then I feel like I can play. And if I can't, you know, if it's just, then it's really hard for me to come up with anything. But again, I mean, this is the kind of thing that, you know, to go back to Duke Ellington's band, I mean, they were all this sophistication, you know, obviously, but it also grooved.
Yes.
And maybe the grooves had a different, just a slightly different accent because it's older, and you have to kind of wrap your head around it, like, oh, okay, yeah, let me not hear it as old, let me imagine it when people were dancing to that.
But see, this is where I think I feel it a little differently. Like, I don't hear it as old. I mean, but
well, it doesn't sound old to me, I
right?
guess.
Exactly.
But to the uninitiated, I could imagine, you know, listening to those records and going, yeah, but you know, that's
but
not...
So then the question is swing inherently old now? Is it not a feeling that speaks to us in a contemporary way?
I think it totally does. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it might be articulated in a different way, but I mean, if you listen to anything from, I mean, there could be a cymbal dang, dang, dang,
Yeah.
dang, dang, and it would just sound a little different, but it wouldn't really change it somehow.
It's almost
to
like when
me.
you hear newscasters from the 30s or whatever, people on television,
Right.
the way they spoke it was just a little more
Right.
30s style, right? Like
Exactly.
maybe that's what the swing beat was, the
Yeah,
same thing.
yeah, it's a different accent on it.
Right.
That can sound old if you're not used to it. And I mean, some of that is just sonic. That was another obstacle, like when I first heard Charlie Parker,
Me too.
was just the quality of the recording. Like there was a huge leap at the end of the 50s, I think. I mean, like there's some incredible recordings from the end of the 50s, but before that, it really was a little, you have to put yourself in it. And also, I can imagine that for people who grew up with electronic sounds, just that everything is acoustic.
Yes. Huh.
You have to get used to that.
Does that inform some of your thinking then about like I was thinking about this. You have twice assembled groups that essentially are bassless.
Yeah.
And so the bass is coming from the low end of an electronic instrument or an
Right.
electric instrument.
Yeah.
Which, if you're accustomed to hearing an acoustic bass at the bottom end of the music,
Yeah.
it's like, whoa, there's something different happening here.
Right.
And a lot of things are happening, but
It does make me play differently somehow as a saxophone player. I mean, that's how you respond to music from the sound that you're hearing. And like the keyboard bass thing that
Yes.
James does, I do have to kind of put myself in another head to, I don't even know what it is I would do differently, but just that sonic blend of like the saxophone with an acoustic bass is very, very different.
yes.
And the same thing like with the underground group,
Yes.
like with the Bottom of the Roads,
Yes.
that had another thing, Volume can be tricky as a saxophone player, someone playing an acoustic instrument. You do have to get used to that. There's a huge comfort in playing with other acoustic instruments that are also bound by they're only so loud.
Yes.
They can't just turn up.
Yep.
But that's not everything that's happening now. So you have to. I don't know. I found that I wanted to figure out a way to play the saxophone in a way that made sense.
Yes.
In
that sense, maybe it's not so surprising that you started using effects then also. I mean, once you were working with
finally. It took me a long time. I really resisted it. I mean, that's something I thought about with underground too.
It was like 10 years ago.
Yeah. And I just didn't want to do it at that time.
Is it, in some way, I read an interview with you in which you connected it to a conversation you had with Ornette when you were young.
Yeah, right. That the saxophone is a really vocal sound. Exactly. And that's the real strength of it, is how much it can be, very human voice.
Yes.
And that there's so many layers of expression that you can get, that a singer can get just singing a melody. I wanted the saxophone to have that role, and if it's constantly covered up, or if there's effects on it all the time, then you're not going to get that subtlety. You're not going to, like when you hear whoever, Ella Fitzgerald, Aretha. I mean, it's just so much information and so much feeling in every note because of the detail of their voice. That was a reason not to really get involved in it.
Well, and your sound. I mean, so much of what you strive for
is
your sound.
You
right?
work so much about to get that sound that you want. Since I have been using it, I've been mainly using it in ways where that feels like it's I'm not losing that necessarily. I'm kind of adding things here and there.
I saw you making kind of pads, basically.
That's another thing, is that like with the with like a looper and some delay, whatever, you can make something to play over.
Yes.
And then when you're playing over it, then you've still got your voice.
Yes.
It's knowing when to engage it so that it has maximum effect, which means not all the time.
But it's, in a way, it's like just this another version of chops, right? It's like you have a thing you can do, doesn't mean you should always do it. Or
that's a very good point. It's another tool that you can use, especially with circuits when it's really in the kind of a synth.
Yes.
Language too. I mean, it really made sense for that to be a part of it.
So you talk about how you do respond to sound, and you can't help but respond to all of the ingredients around you, and also to rhythm. And it raises the question of who you choose to work with. Like you've had these a series of long relationships with different people in your life. Some of them have been very tied to the drums, you know, and like right now, your relationship with Eric Harland is like very deep.
Yeah, we've done a lot of different, been in a lot of different situations together.
How much of your just general creative development is tied to that relationship?
It's really hard to put into words, you know, but it's a feeling of, you know, extreme comfort that, okay, you know, we're operating from, like, we have all this history and we know each other's playing very well and we know each other well, and we can go from that. But also that we're both the kind of people that are looking for something else all the time. So there's a challenge as well. I mean, I guess that's the kind of people that I've sought out to work with, and those are the kind of people that maybe I have had these long musical relationships are people that do have a solid grounding in the history, like the big history, you know, and are looking for something else. I don't know how to explain it, but those are the people that I feel like I can keep making music with over a long period of time, like Eric, like, you know, Dave Holland.
Yes.
I mean,
well, in both cases with Eric and Dave Holland, you've been in a number of different kinds of musical groups.
Yeah.
Do you talk about the music in the projects? Do you have conversations about how this is what the values of this project are, or what we're trying to do?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I feel like we definitely talk about the music and what maybe something that worked that night or something, you know, but not that much.
Yeah.
Not that much. That's another thing. If you need to say too many things, then maybe it's not the right person.
Well, yes.
You know, but that's also how I like to work.
Yes.
Is I enjoy that process of, like, when I write a tune, maybe I have something in mind that it's going to be, but I'm very happy to be not proven wrong, but to have someone come at it from another angle, if that angle also makes musical sense, if it sounds good, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, great. Let's, you know, this is what you're going to put on it.
Yes.
Let's work from that. For me, that ends up with a much richer musical result than whatever I had in my head just on my own. That's why you like being with other people is that you're going to maybe learn something that you wouldn't learn if you just stayed inside your own head.
To what extent do you think is composition today connected to the way the music is changing? Like, you know, there was a long period in the music where basically there was a, you know, set of tunes that everybody played, and certainly by the late 60s that was changing, and people were starting to write and
more and more original forms,
stuff.
Original, like, not based on, I mean, even the you know, like in Charlie Parker, you know, most of those tunes are based on other tunes.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you think that changes what the music is and the way it moves?
That's an interesting question. It opens up a lot of possibilities, obviously, you know, but it also makes it much more difficult somehow. I mean, having that big of a range of things that you can do, I think is, you know, can make it even that much harder to, it's a funny thing. I mean, to really develop a voice that's a coherent, you know, full thing, I mean, you can't reinvent the wheel. I mean, there's a reason that Charlie Parker didn't do that. There was still a lot to do with what he had been given, and he found something completely new on top of that. But yeah, you know, it seemed like it was time in the music, like it could get away from those forms, and also even pop music at the time had gotten away from those forms. You know. And that's even more now. I mean, it's all about the texture. It's so much less about the actual musical content.
Yes.
Which is something that maybe takes the jazz world away from the pop world in a way that it wasn't like that when Coltrane recorded My Favorite Things. You know what I mean? That's a big, interesting subject. I'm trying to think of...
I've been thinking about it a lot, and through these conversations, like, I don't want to misrepresent what anybody said to me.
Yeah.
And I don't remember who said it to me. I think probably Fred Hirsch earlier this year said to me, the information is in the tunes.
Yeah.
If you're trying to learn the language, it's in the songs.
Yeah.
And I thought, right, that's why everybody's got to know these tunes, you know?
Right.
And then the music starts to change because so many people start writing, and they change the form, they change the conditions.
Right.
So the language starts to change, and not just in a subtle way like they put, as you say, it's a different accent that they put on the swing feel, but like it actually really, it changes, it opens, it goes in different directions, and maybe it's a little less coherent. That's
kind of the danger, is that it can veer off into the theoretical academic abyss. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, what I was kind of thinking about when you were saying that too is like, you know, if I think of in the modern kind of moderns now, I don't know, already 50, 60 years ago, I guess, but people that have really two sort of examples, like when you heard John Coltrane playing like at the end of his career, even though he was playing free and there was not necessarily he wasn't playing over specific changes, you could hear the depth of what he knew, how he came from that.
Yes.
In everything that he did, in a way that, I mean, I'm a fan of what Farrell was doing and Archie Shepp. It kind of comes from more of a sonic point of view, but it didn't have that extent of the grounding and harmony that you hear in Train, even when he's at that fever pitch screaming thing. Somehow he's also able to communicate all the things that he's been through. And as a composer, you know, a very different situation, but a little bit related, I think, like Wayne Shorter. I mean, everybody, you know, would love to be able to write like Wayne Shorter.
Yes.
And it feels very modern still, especially, I mean, the things he's been doing in the past 30 years. I mean, it's really different than how he was writing for Blakey, for Miles. Even though he's using some of these same tunes, he's using the material in such different ways. But I think a big reason that what he does sounds so good, and maybe some other people trying to do that aren't quite able to do it, is that same thing, is that depth of knowledge that he is still thinking about Lester Young and Bud Powell, and he's been through it all, and he wrote these tunes that were to be played with Art Blakey, and it had to have that thing, and you still hear that in everything that he's writing, even if he's writing kind of freely orchestrally over something else, you still hear that depth, which is, I think, goes back to the need to really go back and study a lot of stuff and get immersed in a lot of stuff if you really want to make a contribution that has some real staying power.
Yes.
You know?
And on the other hand, I hear you say it. I mean, if Charlie Parker sounded like a million years old to you when you were starting, imagine what it sounds like to a 17-year-old today or a 15-year-old today.
Yeah, exactly.
And to tell a kid, in order to make a contribution, you need to understand this.
It's hard. And I mean, you know, there are other ways to do things. Maybe there's something else that can be built, and you don't have to know. I mean, I don't actually know that John Coltrane knew every record Sidney Bechet ever made.
Right.
Before he picked up a soprano.
That's maybe a misguided way of thinking about it, that you're supposed to know all the information as opposed to, for example, to be able to speak English to each other, we don't have to have read the same books.
Right.
But we have to have a common conception.
A language.
Yeah. And more than just the words. I mean, like, you know, if you've ever had an experience, I'm sure you have them all the time, of speaking English in a country where they've learned the language, but they have none of the cultural or
the
common associations.
Yeah, it can be hard to communicate a certain thing that we could say in 2 words.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. You have to find that sort of... So I don't necessarily know that it's about the... That's what I often think. Is it about the information, or is it about...
That's a good point.
Understanding. I don't know.
Well, that's another thing that I think about when I think about how I grew up listening and how I grew up learning.
Yeah.
I was, I guess, of that kind of last generation that I didn't have access to everything. I mean, it was whatever was at the record store is what I could hear.
Yeah.
So I would get 3 Sonny Rollins records and get to know every note that every musician played on that record. And I didn't know his whole recorded output, but I knew that. And maybe that was time better spent.
Yes.
At the end of the day.
How do you look at that experience in terms of what people often do with your work? Like you've been heavily transcribed, and on the one hand, I've heard you say that may not be the best use of people's time. But I don't know if you're saying that from a point of view of modesty, or if you're saying that from a point of view of that's not necessarily the best way to find your sound.
Wow.
Or if it's neither or both.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a feeling of, man, don't waste time on like go back further. That's my first reaction, you know. But I understand, And yeah, I mean, there's one big advantage right now that I have over Charlie Parker and John Coltrane is that I'm here.
Yes.
That I'm alive right now.
Yep.
That is what it is. So that's what's happening now. That's what people are going to hear. That's what they can go see live. So hopefully they're inspired and they want to check out what it is.
Well, how much time did you put into, I don't hear it so much in your playing. I know the comparison has been there for a long time, but how much time did you put into going to school on Michael Brecker?
I definitely did. I mean, there was an unconscious way that I moved through the music, which I kind of mentioned. Like, you know, I mean, after listening to my parents' records, which, you know, they had Time Out, you know, Dave Brubeck record. They had a couple Miles records working in Steeman. They had some Charles Lloyd records. But then when I got into the music, what I first got into was Duke's band, you know, and then I moved from that to Charlie Parker. Yeah. And from that to, you know, Sonny Rowell, you know, Monk and Miles. And, you know, like I kind of moved forward chronologically without really making that a point to do it, you know. But yeah, by the time I was 16, 17, I mean, I was definitely checking out Mike and going, wow, okay, that's a
I asked
step,
because
you know,
because he was. I mean, a lot of the cats were still alive when you were coming up, but like he was very much alive.
Oh,
he
yeah,
was on new records.
I saw him many times. I mean, I was fortunate to see him many times, to see Joe Henderson many times, Wayne, of course, over the years. But
your first record on Verve, Gratitude, sort of paid homage to all of these influences, right? Yeah. Do you ever think about if you were going to do a project like that today?
Oh, right. Who would I? I don't know. I actually haven't thought about that. But I mean, you know, it was very painful to not have a lot of people on that list. You know, it's like it's a very, very partial list.
There's an aspect of what you do that kind of pays gratitude to your friends and your contemporaries.
Well, that always happens too. Yeah.
Your projects are in a way of celebrating this group of people that your friends, the people that are influencing you or that are inspiring you today.
Yeah, I guess that's natural. I mean, it's funny. Like we listen to the music of the past and the people that aren't with us to make any more records. You know, and also from an older generation. You know, there's a halo around them, maybe in a certain way, because of when they were here. That that as much as I dig Mark Turner's playing and Josh's playing, and you know, people that are my age. Yep. I just don't feel that about them because we're all in the same boat. You know what I mean? And I think that's a natural thing. I have a feeling that's the way it's always been.
Well, that's the thing. How do you think they felt about each other? Those guys.
The way, I mean, it's a scene. It's that kind of nice, inspiring each other to, you know, knowing what we're all checking out, that maybe, oh wow, I hadn't really checked that guy out. Maybe I should, you know, a certain aspect of competition, but in a very respectful, caring way. I mean, that's the feeling I have. That's always among other saxophone players and just everybody. I mean, that's the feeling of community that really is beautiful about the jazz community at its best. Yes. Yeah, I mean, there's always jealousies, there's always, you know, why did this, you know, blah, blah, blah. There's always that kind of stuff. But I really do feel like the community goes beyond that and wants to hear somebody do something great. And when somebody's really putting out something good, everyone's going to go, wow, okay, great, go, you know, we need you, go, you know.
Do you think that within the community people are influencing one another in the way that, like, we could definitely see? I mean, you're obviously influencing a lot of saxophone players, but the way you could see that a Miles record would really have had an influence, everybody had to know that record and kind of.
I think it's more difficult because there's so much being put out, and maybe there's so many different areas of the music. You know, there's no way to put everything there. But I do think, I mean, you know. Honestly, I don't always hear my contemporaries' records all that much, but I'm on the road and I see them and I kind of know what they're up to, and I'm very influenced by it. Yeah. Not even on a conscious level, but just kind of, that's where things, right, that makes sense. That's the way things are moving. And then hopefully I can bring something to that conversation.
That's the way things are moving.
I mean, it is a conversation. You know, art is always like that. It's a conversation with the people from the past that have kind of brought us to this point, and it's also a conversation between those of us that are doing it. That's a huge reason that community is so important. That's the thing that's rough about not having a 52nd Street, you know, where everyone can go hear each other all the time.
I don't say this with judgment. Our 52nd Street is YouTube.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is what it is. It is what it is. And I would prefer an actual physical space, but it's too big for that anyway. You know what I mean? To hear what everybody's doing. I mean, there's just too many people doing too many different things. They wouldn't even fit on one street. You'd have to have a whole, district.
City. Do you hang out on the internet? Do you watch stuff?
I do, yeah.
You fall down the hole like everybody else?
I can totally go in there, yeah. And I mean, so much of it is again, people that are no longer with us. But yeah, then those, suggestions start piling up. It's like, really? That person played with this person? I got to check that out.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, I want to say how wonderful and refreshing and inspiring it is to hear you talk about the music and the world and the community as growing in an organic way, as opposed to simply lamenting what it is or what it was and what it isn't anymore.
Well, yeah. I mean, we can't afford to do that.
Yes.
And there's lots to celebrate. Honestly, I think. I mean, as we're all watching the world kind of fall apart around us, it feels even more precious that I'm out on the road, I'm meeting friends, and hanging out, and able to appreciate that.
Have you felt what you do as different in some way in the last couple of years since the political situation changed?
It maybe has a different feeling of intensity, but no, and I mean. Maybe it's not always, all of it isn't that new. I mean, maybe it's things that have been building. Maybe it's things that have always been there that now you can see, Something that really did turn my head around about it was right after 9/11. Mm-hmm. That it was, the Monterey Jazz Festival is in September every year, in late September. And I was going to play there. A lot of my friends were going to play there. It was like 2 weeks after it happened, and we were all kind of like, me anyway. I was like, man, maybe it's not the time for a jazz festival. Maybe maybe it shouldn't happen. But they kept the festival on, and so we all went. And I was like, man, who's gonna go? Really eerie, like on the plane there, like, it was basically the musicians. We had the plane to ourselves because no one else was flying. And I was like, man, who's even going to come to the festival? Yeah. And there were lots of people there. Yeah. And when I was playing, I felt this need that was kind of different than I had felt before. Like they needed music. Mm-hmm. They needed to be together and to hear some music. Yeah. Like it was the opposite of what I was like, oh man, maybe it's not the time. It's like, no, actually that's when...
That is the time.
That is exactly the time. And that's a big thing that music is for.
Yes.
Is being able to feel things together as a group. I mean, playing live and having people together to hear it.
Yes.
Is really taps into, what this really bizarre phenomenon called music is about for us, that it's this way of connecting, and that in those kind of times it's more important than ever, whether an artist states something explicitly politically or not. Just being there and bringing people together has a good effect. I mean, more and more, I think everyone feels very explicitly that it's really messed up what's happening, and but what exactly do you say about it? How much do you let the music just say? I think everyone has to figure that out for themselves. But that's a big part of what we're all dealing with and what we're all thinking about. So I think it comes out.
I remember when Barack Obama was elected, and there was this period when I felt enormous pride to be an American in the world.
Yeah, totally.
Totally. And that you just had the wind in your sails, like America on a global level just represented the possibility.
Right.
In the last few years, it's been more like, no, we need to represent the possibility in the sense that it's not any one particular figurehead or public, politician. That when you show up on stage and play creative, free, communicative, collaborative music or emotional music, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That you are representing something.
Yeah, you're doing your part. I mean, as a musician,
Yeah.
Maybe there's other things as a citizen that you want to do, but as a musician, I think it's a strange thing to do. It's a strange thing to do.
What you do.
Yeah, to go out and play music for people.
Man,
You know, it's really bizarre, but it's so fantastic.
Do you ever think about that? You sort of alluded to it earlier today, and I feel kind of shocked that I'm even asking you of all people asking this question, but like your life is supported by you blowing into this tube,
vibrating air molecules. Yeah. No, it's completely insane. The only reason it has any meaning is because of this strange human ability to interpret it as a language and as something that spoken or written language can't replace, really. That the sounds and the particular harmonics coming together in a certain way, certain rhythms, make you feel something, can help people feel something that they might not be able to get to any other way.
Yeah.
That's why we're there.
Yeah.
That has every kind of component of every kind of part of life. I mean, music by itself, is meaningless, except that it's connected to culture, it's connected to feelings, it's connected to, every aspect of a person's life. Political, sexual, relationships with people that are older, people that are younger, just everything about it. Music can speak to that.
Yes.
So it can be a very, very powerful force. At the same time, especially in what we do. I'm a saxophone player, so there's no words, it's very abstract and yet not abstract at all. This is something that I think about a lot, and and on a certain level, it's the only way that I can evaluate my own music. Is am I putting out what I want to put out? Like, is this really what feels right? And again, It's so abstract that
right.
It could be anything, but not.
Do you feel, given that, do you feel that you are improving?
I hope so.
Is that a goal, to improve?
Yeah. I'd say it's and which is maybe to it's hard to know if that's at a certain level what
that means.
What that means.
Yeah.
But in the same way that like you would hope that as people, you can improve. Now maybe you're not going to change what you're made of and the forces that have shaped you and the forces that continue to shape you and your own things that are driving you.
Yeah.
But hopefully you can gain the wisdom through all your mistakes and all your searching, to be able to treat people in the way that you want to treat them, and also treat yourself in the way that that's healthy.
Yes.
Like whatever that means, having the discipline to hold it down, and also having being able to decide, okay, this is not the time for discipline. This is the time to let it go.
Uh-huh.
That's a part of wisdom too. So, so in that way, yes, I hope my music is improving in that same way.
And when you listen to yourself play, when you hear recordings or you hear yourself back, do you hear it in those terms?
Yeah. The things that bug me the most aren't missing a beat or something like that. It's coming at it from some angle that I know is just jive in some way. Trying to pretend I know something that I don't, or trying to be impressive, or whatever, human insecurity can lead you down.
Well, I think, like I was saying earlier, like I forget how young you are because you've been doing it for so long, but the great thing about jazz is that it allows you to get older. It rewards you for getting older. Yeah, I think
that's another thing that I do love about this music, is that, Herbie and Wayne, people, the veneration that people have for these older musicians. Yes. Unfortunately, not all of them are in that kind of position, but that real feeling that this wisdom that comes with age is really valuable.
Yes.
To all of us, is again not something that's necessarily supported in the culture at large, but should be.
Yes.
And it is great as a musician to be able to think that, okay, so, it's not like I just had my moment of glory when I was 23 and I made the video and now it's and then now that's over.
It is a thing, right? Like when a big part of your story, at least to the public at large, is that you're young and you're good.
Yeah.
You can stay good and even get better, but you can't stay young for very long.
Nope.
And then you're just kind of there,
Right.
If your like whole narrative is wrapped up in being young, like that won't stay with you very long. That won't help you. That's why I think it's so interesting to celebrate any creative person for their youth.
Yeah, right.
Because you might be celebrating what they're doing, but you really are just celebrating youth. to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of like, wow, to be able to get that kind of information together at that age, that's amazing.
That was you, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it shows that some things are possible for humans that maybe, most people don't end up doing. Maybe that is a real inspiration in some way.
Yes.
But yeah, that's nowhere that you can stay as an artist. You can't live there the rest of your life. You have to keep growing. And jazz of all forms, I mean, it's about the moment. And there's a moment when you're 18, and there are other moments when you're 35, and there's other moments when you're 65, and there are challenges to each part in life. There's things that you don't know because you haven't been through it before. And you have to make it up as you go along, no matter how old you get. Yeah. Nothing prepares you for what's going to happen.
Right. Just because you've been 80 doesn't mean you know what 95 is going to feel like.
Exactly. Yeah, right. I hope we're all so lucky to have that problem, you know. That's why the aesthetic of jazz, that's what it means to me, if anything, is like reacting and trying to face the challenge of something that you just don't know the right or the wrong or the best or the, you gotta just take a stab at it, and also appreciate maybe the beauty of what's going on as it comes and goes, which is a process that you see like in the greatest musicians. That's why their music gets deeper and deeper. Maybe technically they lose something eventually, but still they have so much to say that couldn't be done by someone who hadn't been through it.
Maybe some of the depth comes from the loss.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Of course.
Dealing with the loss.
Yeah.
I think that the whole approach to this conversation today has just been absolutely wonderful in not only what it is, but what it isn't. I mean, and how sort of non-technical it is, and how much it is rooted in the human experience and in the desire to create and express and to continue to change. And I mean, that's what I feel from you.
Well, that's what I think about a lot. Thanks.
Chris Potter, thank you so much, man.
Thank you.
This was great.
Thank you. Yeah.
There he was, my friends, the great, the sweet, the thoughtful, the introspective, the incredible Chris Potter. I'll be back again soon with another deep dive. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.